Welcome back to the Men We Are podcast. I'm Kieran, and this is episode 17, and also the final episode in season 1 of the Men We Are podcast. I can almost hear your collective sighs of relief that it's finally over. As this is the final episode of the season, it isn't an episode where we're going to learn something new. And in truth, I don't really think I've been teaching you anything anyway. And I'm not being bashful or playing with words, messing about with the semantics. I set out to learn and understand myself, improve, grow. And as I worked through those various things, I found that they led to others and others and others. And therefore, by sharing with you, by giving you an idea of the things I was learning and the realizations I was making, the struggles I was going through, hopefully you were able to make your own realizations and potentially get on your own journey of growth. And I can tell you from experience, it feels so incredibly liberating to be on the journey, to dare myself to take that path that's less trodden. Because for those of you that think by getting in touch with my feelings and emotions, I'm less of a man or I've become more feminine, you're either not paying attention, you're stubbornly sitting with the traditional values, so we still need to unlock something, or you've just simply never seen me in the gym, where I look like the cross between a gorilla learning to use tools and a caveman chasing his dinner. My manliness it's no longer a reflection of how I fit within the dimensions society has set out for me, but rather it's based on the choices that I'm making about who I am in spite of that pretty restrictive box. So that means on this episode, there's no new frameworks, no concepts to master, because psychologically, growth doesn't happen when we keep adding insight. It happens when you take the opportunity to pause long enough to integrate the new knowledge with what we already know. So in neuroscience terms, this is literally the difference between information and consolidation. Learning things can happen very, very quickly, but integrating those things takes a lot more time. So today is an opportunity to pause, a chance to step back and actually see what has shifted. And we're not just talking in theory, it's how you relate to yourself, how I relate to myself. Because when you're in the middle of change, it doesn't feel particularly dramatic. But what we might see is you might realize you're noticing more, or you're maybe reacting a little later. And most importantly, when you do react, it's a bit more thoughtful, or you're allowing yourself to feel things that you otherwise would have bypassed previously. And you're also starting to question just a bit more the stories that you used to believe automatically. And it's only in hindsight that you'll realize that something has actually fundamentally changed, something has moved within you. And I can attest to that. I used to think I really cared about what other people thought of me. I probably didn't think it. I probably cared what other people thought of me. But as I've matured as part of this journey, I've realized that the only people that really matter are the chap in the mirror who is being honest with me, and he can be brutally honest at times, and those people that are actually important to me, those people that I value their opinion above all else. So if those people are noticing a change in me and they're surprised in a positive way, then that's the only review I really need, because it means I'm on the right track. So this episode is about kind of naming that movement. And it's obviously not an ending. It's a clear recognition of the journey that has begun. Because perhaps you didn't realize, or you don't realize, how much thought you're starting to give to things. Some of the things that we've discussed have been inspiring you to think about things in different ways. And therefore, there's been a not on your level noticeable, but for other people, a mindset change. And obviously, if you have learned from the show, it's helping your growth or just generally putting things into some sort of perspective. Please do give the show a follow, download the episodes, recommend it to friends, make comments, because all of these things help to promote the show, promote the content, which means it will put it in front of the right people, the people that need the help, the people that they're maybe a little bit stuck, or they can't answer certain questions, they're at a bit of a loss. So by doing all of those things, you'll help them. Okay. So at the beginning of the season, we weren't trying to fix men, and that does matter because a lot of men already feel like projects. So what we were actually doing was building an awareness. So in psychology, that is always the first intervention. And it does sound so obvious, but you can't change something if you don't know it's there. So awareness has to come before you can do any sort of behavior changes, before emotional regulation can kick in, before you start to adjust your communication skills. So to get things on the right track, we started talking honestly about emotional armor, distance, busyness, the pressure from society to be steady and useful and reliable. All of those buzzwords that we saw coming up so often. And it's not because men are defective, but because most of us, we organized our entire identity around survival. And survival strategies, they're not moral failings, they're intelligent responses at the time to our early environments. But no matter how intelligent the response was, because they were born of survival and we knew that they kept us safe, we don't have any drive to try and reflect on them and see if they're actually relevant anymore. And therefore, we have a lack of awareness of them as to how relevant they are, and we don't know if they need to be adjusted. So I think from my perspective, adaptation isn't the problem, but once you do adapt, staying there, that's the key part. Because you have to have a real willingness to change your behavior. And that willingness is so powerful, it just keeps driving your intention. And a great example is if you think about the January gym crowd, they kickstart the year with a clear mindset, a clear intent that they're going to go to the gym, they go every single day, but they didn't have an intention that was actually strong enough to keep them going. And by about Valentine's Day, the membership fee might as well be flushed down the toilet. So they're looking around the gym at people that have done the work on themselves, and not for days or weeks or even months. The other people that they're looking at have done it for years. And doing things for years, it's not a whimsical decision. It takes a real commitment. So those people quitting after 6 weeks is a sign that they simply haven't keyed into the fact that, you run a marathon by taking one step after another, after another, after another. You keep the effort up. And their intention just simply wasn't strong enough to direct their soul towards that necessary level of continuous effort to work towards the goal. So if you have found something that gives you the intention that is strong enough to make meaningful change, don't lose sight of it or let it go, and keep reminding yourself what it means. And if you haven't found something, this is really, you do need to work to find what that is, because it's important. And I'm not taking the easy option here, but I can't tell you what that is. Only you can decide that. Because for me, I found mine. I found the thing that gives me the intent and the willingness to change. And I have absolutely no doubt about it. So the only suggestion I can make, if you're struggling to find something that really, really clarifies your thoughts and makes you want to change, if you're struggling to find that thing, don't go looking for a grand purpose, because that will end up creating a bit of urgency in you. And the urgency, it can get things done sometimes, but with this, where we're trying to think about things, it could stop you seeing things with clarity. So instead, just try and sit still long enough to start considering and feeling what's unresolved in your life. And then you might start, you might stop distracting yourself from dissatisfaction, because then your intention, it will become visible, because it's usually hiding in the things that you've been avoiding. So certainly for me, the willingness to change was born of wanting to make myself better for something that was so much bigger than myself. And in my case, it was a relationship. Um, and I can't think of anything bigger and more powerful than love to instigate change in a person. And I mean meaningful change. I'm not talking about putting the toilet seat down, but meaningful change. And the reason love is so powerful is it gives us a continuous reminder of why we're trying to change. You know, that person is there. There's such a focus for us. And yes, of course, change for your own benefit is great, but it's never going to compare to changing for the better and having someone to share that with. And for those of you that sort of don't really buy into that, I'm always drawn to the really wonderful story of the Brazilian road cyclist. I forget her first name. Her surname was Fernandez. And it was in the Rio Olympics, so her home Olympics as well. And there is a video of this. She finished sixth or seventh. So it wasn't a podium finish, but it wasn't anything to turn your nose up at, because it was the highest placing of a Brazilian cyclist ever. And after crossing the line, on the video, she appears emotionally drained, very sad. And she said the moment felt empty because she had no one there to immediately share it with. But shortly after, her cousin managed to fight his way through the crowd to her. And her entire deflated demeanor immediately changed. It was so wonderful. Their embrace and energy, it was so touching. It was one of the more touching scenes from that Olympics, maybe for the Brazilian Olympic team ever. And as a sporting romantic, I just found it a very touching scene. And for me, it was a very powerful example of how achievement, no matter how great, it can feel incomplete without someone there to share it with. So one of the most important psychological reframes this season offered was the traits that protected you, and we talked about this earlier, are actually now costing you. So in attachment theory, we call this adaptive strategies. And it's the idea that if being emotionally quiet kept the peace, or competence would get approval, or being self-reliant and not relying on anyone meant you'd avoid disappointment, because other people could potentially disappoint you. They were all strong enough that you would lean into them. And the problem isn't that you adapted. The problem is that the adaptations, they became identities. And they certainly did if you didn't come back to them and re-examine them. And that's where a lot of men find themselves in midlife, because they're not failing, but they're succeeding in a role that no longer really fits, or they're not as driven or interested in. But certainly the not fitting, you know, they're in the role of the provider or the fixer or the strong one. And those roles are they're external, they're career, responsibility. But internally, something has gone a bit flat. So that flatness is not depression, it's disconnection. And disconnection is always going to come with a cost. So if we stick with the idea of a role, we're playing a role, psychologist Dan McAdams talks about narrative identity, and it's the stories you tell yourself about who you are and how your life makes sense, as if we try to justify things. And we've seen this story come up over and over. And throughout season one, we kept circling this idea that many men are, you know, living inside stories they never consciously chose. And they're stories like, I'm the reliable one, or I don't need much, other people have it worse, I can deal with it later. They all seem to make some level of sense. But the reason we buy into them is that the stories will reduce inner conflict. And that does seem like a benefit, but if we're reducing the conflict, we're also dampening our emotions. And that means we also reduce the range of those emotions. So you get to a point when a story goes unquestioned for too long, and it stops being a story, instead it transitions to reality. And that will come with some level of confusion, because the story was something you bought into and you believe, but because it wasn't quite true, you have a niggling feeling in the back of your head. And when that niggling feeling appears, that's when men start saying, I don't know what I feel anymore, or I feel like I've lost something, or I'm just going through the motions. I'm surviving my own life. And they're not vague complaints. They're signals of like identity foreclosure. And identity foreclosure it's like a psychological minority reporting system. The only way I can make that make sense is the Tom Cruise film. It's about 20 years old now, of the same name, Minority Report. And they have the psychics laying in a pool with stuff attached to their heads, and they're trying to solve crimes before they happen. It's very futuristic. But there'll be three opinions or reports on a crime, and the minority one gets disregarded in favor of the majority. And it's the same here, where the dominant narrative in your head of who you're supposed to be becomes the majority prediction. And if other possibilities emerge that don't quite align with that, that's the minority report. And that can be ignored, or at least you give yourself permission to ignore it to preserve a bit of coherence. And that means part of the self are shut down to maintain that coherence. And that, to me, sounds quite bad. And that's because it is. You're shutting... Yeah, you stay orderly. Your brain, your sense of self, it stays orderly, but you're shutting down a part of yourself. And if you shut down that part entirely forever, you have killed a bit of yourself. So that means you're going forward as someone that's incomplete. Now, you could argue if they're toxic traits, that's a good route to take. But if the parts you shut down are gone purely because they didn't fit the direction your life went, but they were beautiful things, that will give you that chronic ache. So as we progress through the season, midway through the season, we found there was definitely a shift off the back of that, and we started talking about grief. Just that word doing enough to stir up, notions and memories of sadness and disappointment. But we were very careful not to pigeonhole grief as a catastrophe. Instead, grief was recognized as like unacknowledged loss. And therefore that loss, it doesn't have to be limited to death. The scope is massive. But the headliners are that we grieve what we grieve. It could be something like an unlived life, an abandoned version of ourselves, a relationship that stayed functional and never felt safe. Or closely related to that, I suppose, a relationship that didn't feel safe because we didn't do the right things within that relationship. But we knew that we knew the relationship could have been more powerful, and we're grieving because deep down we know that if we had made ourselves more vulnerable, it would have gotten there. And because it's deep down, we haven't properly acknowledged the fact, and that's the loss, which is how it manifests as grief. Remember, we said it's unacknowledged loss, and if it's buried, we don't even see it's there. And if we don't have an awareness of it, we can't start the process. This goes right back to what we started today's episode with. So the magic of acknowledging your feelings is that things become better, but the tragedy occurs when you don't. But think of any of those situations and really think, if you're grieving something strongly, men will often experience this as tiredness or irritability, restlessness, numbness. We kind of redirect the emotion, because grief that isn't named, it doesn't disappear, it will convert to something else. And often it converts into withdrawal or resentment, emotional distancing, bitterness maybe. But naming grief is not going to weaken you, and acknowledging it's not going to ruin you either. It will restore some level of like emotional accuracy. And there's been times in my life where I've seen those manifestations. Been a bit restless. I'd slept. I'd had a good 8 or 9 hours. I was rested. My diet was good. So everything was there that needed to be there. But I wasn't tired. Deep down, I perhaps had been reminded recently of parts of me, parts of my life, previous parts of my life that weren't there anymore, and therefore I was grieving them. And I just never acknowledged that properly. The easy example is with my career. So many of my friends are pilots, and we have this like level of mobility for work and moving around the place. And I've made choices that have meant working in one place and living somewhere else to make family life work. But it makes it very difficult to keep those friendships going tightly because we all have rosters, we all have demands, family commitment. We live in totally different places anyway. But the simple act of saying out loud, God, I just miss hanging out with my friends. It honestly did wonders for me because I was acknowledging the feeling and pinning down why I was feeling the way I was. So the situation wasn't going to change. But as we saw, in order to come to terms with the grief, the first task is to acknowledge what's actually made you feel sad, not tired. And then the grief can go a different way instead of progressing into resentment, which is potentially the situation you're in now. And that acknowledgement is so vitally key to growth because we established that if you do acknowledge things that you are sad about, that give you shame, anything that leaves you in a state of discomfort, if you can stay with that discomfort, you massively increase your capacity for change. And that has to be one of the most practical yet deceptive shifts we explored, just the act of learning to stay. And in psychology, this is distress tolerance. If we're looking at more spiritual ideas like mindfulness, it's non-avoidance. And it's just basically our nervous system being given the opportunity to build more capacity for regulation. So where your default behaviors were like distract myself, fix things, push through, numb myself, instead, staying with discomfort feels counterintuitive, even dangerous, but you can't change if you can't stay present with something. Like you can't change a thing if you can't stay present with it. And when men learn to sit with discomfort, they stop outsourcing that regulation and take ownership of their problems. They'll react less impulsively. They'll gain emotional choice as they become more aware. So that's not softness, it's real, tangible growth. And I've definitely found in the last few months, as I've had this real hunger and urge for growth, that I've read and learned so many things that I otherwise wouldn't have given the time of day to. And honestly, I am embarrassed and feel quite a bit of shame that I was so narrow-minded and dismissive. But the logical part of my psyche has given way to some of the more spiritual texts, not because I'm window shopping for a monastery to move to, but because I clearly didn't have all the answers before. So why not open my mind up a little bit? So I've enjoyed reading about two rather spiritual practices, Buddhism, and then within that specifically Zen, and how they relate to the fact that I seem to have this need for outcome. I'm outcome focused, and that affects my state of presence. So I could be chatting with someone who's venting about a problem that they have, and I know the solution, and I kind of want to blurt it out to stop the rot. So my attention is already drifting. I'm furtively searching for the opportunity to interject and give them that solution. And Buddhism suggests that this comes from my discomfort with their pain and the fact that I don't know what to do with that feeling. So it's a lack of range from my position. So if I can give them the solution, I will end my discomfort and their pain. So I'm getting 2 for 1. But if I do that, I could be robbing someone of meaning and integration. Instead, if I let them vent, I'm not being passive. Instead, I'm just respecting their process of becoming, which is really beautifully summarized by the saying, don't interrupt the river whilst it's flowing. So with many emotions, learning to sit with them can be so important, in this case, for the growth of the other person as well as ourselves. And being part of someone else's process can be integral in forging a really solid relationship. And I achieve all of that by keeping my mouth shut and just listening. And that theme of being able to sit with things perhaps do less or just suppress our urges to act impulsively, it did come up later on in the season as we were confronting masculinity. And when we say confronted, it almost sounds like we're being combative in order to tear it down, and make it into something that makes more sense. And that's simply not what was meant, as we didn't want to dismantle masculinity or the term. We wanted to expand what masculinity meant. So the confrontation was more an attack on the definition rather than how we actually live the way masculinity should be. So psychologist Robert Bly, he talked about mature masculinity and how that's achieved through integration. And it's not domination or this age-old value of stoicism. Modern psychology agrees with that the idea that holding in our emotions or even shutting them down is a show of strength, it's just nonsense. It's been challenged, refuted, debunked. Real strength is being able to access your emotions without collapsing. So a strong man can be the one that feels things and stays grounded, can take responsibility without going into a shame spiral, can hold tension without having to discharge it onto others. So it's not a rejection of strength. Well, no, maybe it's a rejection of traditional definitions of strength. But for me, it's adult strength. It's a different way of looking at things. So the word strength has taken on such a different meaning for me to the way I previously thought of it. And if the work I have done and you followed during the season has been effective, in theory, those changes in what I think is strong, they're not dramatic. They're quiet, very subtle, perhaps uncomfortable at times, but most importantly, they are totally grounded in intention. The intention to want to be better, to improve, to act on things that you regret or I regret or grieve instead of hiding them away. A powerful intention that each and every one of you has to find, and we talked about that earlier, in order to keep pulling you forward, pulling you along. And I found mine, and as much as I do the work, the intention keeps me going with that upward momentum. So that means you might notice now you experience a pause before you react, or there's less urgency to fix things. You've got more curiosity about your inner state and who you are. And discomfort doesn't feel, it doesn't feel threatening anymore. These are not personality changes. They're structural shifts in how you relate to yourself. And those changes will compound. And I talked about how guys get into trouble and death by 1,000 cuts, when the damage is done over time, small damages all compound, you get worn down and you chronically suffer. But I wish I knew what the antithesis is in the positive light, because most men don't fall apart in one moment. It's the gradual wearing down. And that also means that they don't heal in one moment either. So if it's death by 1,000 cuts, perhaps it's life by 1,000 intentions. I'm not sure they'll print t-shirts with that, but for me it makes enough sense to ring true for my perspective of change, both in the negative and recently the positive light. So we see that season 1 has been about awareness, noticing, feeling, building. Season 2 is going to lean more into truth, and truth always threatens something: our identity, our self-image, attachment, our ability to control. So as this season's come up, topics have come up, as this season's progressed, topics have come up that I didn't have the chance or the opportunity to expand on. And it wasn't through laziness or fear, but respect for the complexity of those things, their power, and the need for them to be explored properly and not rushed as an afterthought. I had planned to take a break after this season for some reflection and to integrate some of the things into my day-to-day life, whilst also giving me the bandwidth to finalize some of the challenges I'm currently facing in my life. But as the saying goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So I've decided to change what's going to happen between now and season 2. Instead of applying radio silence, I found that progressing through an arc like this in season 1 has made my learning process make more sense. Hopefully, as a result, that has also helped you to take on board any of that new information. So season 2 is going to follow an arc again, and it will go from exposure, confrontation, responsibility, and then finally ending, hopefully, with freedom. And I am both nervous and excited at the opportunity to guide you through that. So in the gap between season 1 and 2, I'll still broadcast some stuff, but each episode will be a complete standalone. The topics not following an order or theme, so they're able to be considered totally in isolation. There'll be shorter, quicker, bite-sized editions, but that doesn't mean they'll be any less potent or thought-provoking. Some of the ideas have left me pretty dizzy about how many directions they simultaneously pull my mind. And then once some of those have given our brains something new to consider, we'll get into the next arc and we'll take another journey together. So on the basis of that plan, if you take one thing away, just one thing that you carry forward, I'd be so happy if it was that you don't need to perform your way into having worth, and you don't need to suppress and sacrifice your way into being seen as strong. And you don't need the real you to disappear in order to be seen as dependable. And that means you're allowed to be capable, steady, emotionally real. And that combination, it's not a contradiction. It just makes you psychologically whole. So remember, this isn't a skill like juggling balls or doing a wheelie on a bike or cooking the perfect steak. And you have to avoid the temptation, which we as men so often do. We ask, have I mastered this? Instead of trying to decide, have I completed it? It's not a level on your Xbox. You need to be asking yourself, am I more aware? Do I return to myself quicker? Am I less afraid of what I feel? And if the answer is yes to any of those, even slightly, that is real growth. And it means we're going in the right direction. Because the men we are becoming, they're not built in breakthroughs. They're built in moments of honesty, moments of integrity, and those moments of choosing presence over performance. So thank you for joining me during this season. Season 2 will perhaps go a little bit deeper, but for now, I'd like you to live this. Just notice yourself. Stay with the feelings that you feel. Let them be felt. And let strength and openness exist in the same body at the same time. Because maybe the most powerful shift a man can make is not becoming someone else, but becoming the greatest and fullest version of who he is already. So I wish you all a good rest from the show. I hope you can sit with some of the things we've discussed and apply them as part of your own growth journey. I look forward to coming back and steering the next arc. And as ever, I wish you all the best of luck.